Welcome, everybody. Hello, I'm Melissa Lazaro. I'm the Director of Marketing for Mindprint Learning. If you're not familiar with Mindprint Learning, Mindprint is the only K-12 solution that uses objective cognitive data to pinpoint how a student learns best, and also provides a strengths-based personalized learning plan to develop student efficacy. On behalf of Mindprint Learning, we welcome you to today's webinar titled, What's the Deal with Challenging Behavior? I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Tsai and Meredith McNerney. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So the question always comes up, are we recording the webinar? Yes, we are. And so we'd be happy to share that recording with you. We know that sometimes things come up in the middle of a webinar timeframe and you need to get pulled out of your office. And so just know that we're going to email you after today. We'll have a link to the recording. Give us till about Friday to get that done. And we'll also be providing any sort of resources that are shared on today's webinar. You'll notice that the chat is disabled. And so what we've done is we've provided the opportunity for you to put any of your questions into the Q&A. So there's no disruption there to the webinar. You can put in your questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll either answer them live if we think it's something really specific to maybe your situation, or if it's something that can benefit the entire webinar audience, we'll go ahead and answer that at the end of today's webinar during our Q&A. We would love for you to participate in our polls. We've got a few polls. You notice the one that's there right when you entered. So go ahead and feel free to continue to participate in those polls throughout the webinar. So let's get started. You know, the buzz in education right now is that problem behaviors are more pervasive post-pandemic. But what we want to ask the question during today's webinar is that true? And if so, where is it coming from? And more importantly, how do we address it? Today, we have two experts in cognitive science and behavior. Both published articles in the recent ASCD EL magazine, and the topics were focused on challenging behavior. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to host and bring them in and continue the conversation from the articles and what was shared in those. We're honored today to have them with us during our fireside chat. So first, we have Meredith McNerney, author, speaker, and former principal, and she's also president of Commerce Schools. Meredith works with schools and businesses across the country to teach others how to cultivate calmer environments. Additionally, she serves as an adjunct professor at Shepherd University. Meredith earned her degree in elementary education from East Carolina University and her master's degree as a reading specialist at Townsend University. She's currently finishing her her doctoral program at Northeastern University. And for those of you that enjoy podcasts, check out her podcast where she's the host of Super Glue Podcast. Second, we have Dr. Nancy Tsai, researcher at MIT and instructor at Harvard. Dr. Tsai is an expert in cognitive neuroscience where she examines the link between executive functions and human well-being. She completed her scholarly training at UC Berkeley, Harvard University, UC Irvine, and is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at MIT. Dr. Tsai is a well-published researcher who has won numerous awards and grants and fellowships for her scientific work, including funding from the National Science Foundation and private funding from Google and Accenture. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome you to Meredith and Dr. Tsai. So thank you so much for joining us today.
So great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, man, that was a whirlwind of what I had to do to introduce both of you. But hopefully, I just can't wait. I know the audience is too. So excited to hear from both of you. So I brought this up earlier. You know, the buzz in education is that problem behaviors are more pervasive. But what I want to ask you both is, do you think that's true, or do you think it's just an impression? So what do you think?
Well, I'll jump in and say, I definitely think that's true. I was a principal before, during, and after the pandemic, and saw the change in my own students. I'm married to an incredible teacher who's still in the field as a middle school teacher today, and he will tell you the same. But in our work across the country, we're hearing that over and over again. Emotion regulation being one of the biggest changes that we've seen in student behavior. So I'm really excited about this webinar and the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this topic today, because I do think it's prevalent and I think it's a relevant and timely topic.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Tsai, what are you seeing from a research perspective?
Absolutely. I just want to add to that. What Meredith just said is that, problem behavior that we're seeing with youth nowadays, we're seeing it manifest in both the classroom and also outside of the classroom, and sort of like across the spectrum in and out of the classroom. We're seeing reports that students are, there's a crisis of like mental health, and like, depression and anxiety are on the rise with our youth. And so these are definitely impacting their behaviors, their emotion regulation, and also their learning in a myriad of ways. And so we'll definitely, I'm excited to dive into this topic.
And so what do you think are some of the reasons? I mean, social media gets a really bad rap for saying, what the cause of this challenging behavior. Is it that students just are caring less about school, or they haven't had the typical development that they needed because they were out of school in many states? So what are the causes of this? Or are these just hypothetical reasons? What's the research saying? What are you seeing in the classroom and on school sites, Meredith?
I'm happy to jump in. Oh, go ahead, please, Dr. Tsai.
Okay, I'll jump in on this one, but from sort of a cognitive perspective, where there's probably a lot of different causes, right? It's hard to just say that there's like only one cause for like problem behavior, but at least from, like one thing that we're seeing is that, as a result of the pandemic, I think, everyone can say that it was an incredibly stressful time. And so, coming, out of this pandemic period, students are just, really kind of getting over the effects of experiencing long-term stress. I think that there's, a lot of research has been done, prior to the pandemic, but most recently, I think the NIH just released a study, a longitudinal study looking at youth or adolescents, and like their behaviors and their brains before the pandemic and also like during the pandemic. And what resulted was like really interesting. They found that students or youth really, they were, they had not only just like way higher self-reported stress, anxiety, sort of like a lot of these like emotion regulation, a lot of these affective issues, but they also were seeing changes in the brain and in the areas that are like really critical for their classroom function, I would say. So they were noticing that changes in the brain look like smaller volume in the prefrontal cortex, which is really important for executive functions, which we can talk about in a second, and also even in areas like the hippocampus, which is critical for memory processing and things. And so this, all of this is to say that, one big cause, or I would say smoking gun, that a lot of research is pointing to right now is really that it's stress and how, it's impacting our brain development, our brain function, and how this then has trickle down effects into, performance and behavior and sort of all these other things that might look like problem or challenging behavior in the classroom.
Okay.
No, I would agree. And I think I love the point you made around stress. And I think if we all think back to the pandemic and the stress we were all under, children and adults alike, and so many of us use our phones today and during the pandemic as a way to self-soothe, right? So I think that frequency of picking up the phone was something that became a little more habitual when we were isolated. And for many students, developmentally, they're exposed to things that they should not yet be seeing. So that exposure at such a fast and high rate, whether it's, more sexual in nature or it's something related to mental health, but they don't have the background to understand what it really means. And they're constantly engaging in this content that's not developmentally appropriate. And then you couple that with the pandemic where we're all under stress. And for some families, the only way that they were able to get through it was the use of screen time because, parents had to keep working and put food on the table. So you have this combination of exposure to the screen because I want to self-soothe. I'm not sure how to manage the feelings that I'm having. And we're not then relational in our interactions. So most of our interactions became on Zoom or, in our homes without a lot of exposure to other people. So I think that combination of more use of the phone, exposure to social media, and then lack of relationships. We are humans and we need relationships. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that we've seen as students have come back, that difficulty with socializing. And that was taken away from them for a long time, and they forgot how to socialize, and they stopped practicing and turned to the phone a lot instead.
Do you have anything else to add to that, Dr. Tsai, before I go into kind of a segue question regarding the student perspective?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, what's really interesting is that, like, I think kids, when we talk about this interesting pandemic period, and it could be, like acute stress of like looking at numbers change on the news about like how many people are, infected with COVID and are having to deal with it, and like uncertainty of a lot of things, like, self-soothing and, being exposed to things on social media that we might not be prepared to encounter as youth or something. And there's all these different factors, and something, at least what I've studied even prior to the pandemic, for a long period of time, was I really looked at, how chronic stress, so stress that we experience on a persistent daily basis, how that changes our brains over time and how that translates to brain function. And we have like decades worth of research on that. But I think what the pandemic really did was accelerated that, because everyone went through, like, people that might not be experiencing chronic poverty, or exposure to pollution as youth, and all those things that are generally like, special like populations. Pandemic forces all to have experienced chronic stress. And so when they're doing research on, brains of kids prior to the pandemic versus kids during the pandemic, it was just shocking to see that the brains of people, going through the pandemic, it very much mirrored kids who had gone through chronic exposure, chronic experiences of stress, like acute poverty, for a very, very long time. And that just is like such a unique thing that we've never seen before. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different incredible causes. And so, how we want to add and, like pick that all apart, it's just like really interesting how it all manifests into our behaviors and our brains and our function and things like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that from the student perspective for a moment. Could problems with cognition underlie the challenging student behavior that we're seeing? So even just, we know that everybody's in an elevated state of stress and trying to come back down from that and recover from that, but our brains are all different to begin with, right? And so if there's any sort of cognitive challenge that's occurring with or without that stress level, what does that look like in the classroom? And knowing that the added stress is just going to, in your point, accelerate the way that some of those behaviors look in the classroom. So
yeah, so from the student perspective, and I think Meredith can very eloquently speak to this, to like the teacher's perspective, but from the student's perspective, they're cognitively, they're just not, they don't know how to cope, right? So stress is going to, strain, or I would say even undermine their cognitive abilities, their executive functions, and their memory abilities. And so they're not going to be performing their best, right? So you might have a student that typically would do really well in the classroom, and suddenly when they're under a lot of stress, suddenly they're like acting out, or they're not really, they're not really like, they're not performing their best. And this could really just be a result of their like, underlying cognitive functions not being supported, or not being sort of at their peak. And so I think that understanding the cognitive piece can definitely explain this problem behavior in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And so from your perspective, how can teachers support student executive function then in the classroom? How can they support these challenges that might be arising?
So we can think of it in terms of like executive functions, and then memory. Like long-term memory, like memory retrieval. And so both are incredibly critical for and essential for learning. Executive functions, I would say, like, there's, without getting too nitty-gritty into all the different types of executive functions, broadly speaking, there's just, people can talk about it in terms of like working memory or inhibition and shifting. But broadly speaking, as a family of these functions, there's a lot of different things that can be done to support them that might not necessarily be, like forcing them to do like executive function training in the classroom, but it could just be as simple as like taking a break, taking time to exercise, really like sort of not taking away PE and physical activities or team sports, but allowing students to sort of move around and, like get going physically. Those are all actually quite, like robustly measured activities that are like helpful for like executive function long term. So there's lots of interesting studies about how physical activity, either yoga or martial arts or whatever activity, can translate to improved executive functions. And then, beyond the sort of exercise, PE, sports realm, there's also things that are, that are kind of becoming more mainstream, like meditation.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that students can do in or outside the classroom. They can easily, like do this at home. And I think there's a lot of interesting work around like breathing exercises. That's also a form of meditation, and how breathing, these sort of alternate forms of, I would say, exercise are really helpful for bringing down cortisol levels and bringing down the heart rate, and all these sort of activities, be it like really physical or more mental. They're actually really helpful for helping you sort of recoup and like re-energize your executive functions. And then there's also either even programs that teachers can sort of look into. This is not so much of, this would probably require student or adult sort of aid for students in the classroom, but like there are interesting programs that look at both, that are looking at how cognitive functions and also social emotional functions work together to sort of enhance cognitive well-being, sort of like social emotional things like mindset work, like by Carol Dweck. And there's also all sorts of really interesting work there. I can go on and on about the executive functions, but you probably want, I don't know, do you want me to move on to like memory?
Yeah,
but
let's talk about the memory part of it too. I'm just thinking of like what that looks like in the day-to-day for a student. Like a student comes in, it's now they're shifting, like they're going to art class, and all of a sudden the teacher says, there's no art class today. Sorry, the teacher's out sick. And that might be the one thing that brings, calm and peace and feels like success to a student that struggles in other academic areas. And so like what's happening in the brain at that point, when we're thinking about a lower level of flexible thinking for a particular child that enjoys art, what's happening then in the brain when we're seeing the behavior, which is what, and they lose their cool because they're so disappointed is the bottom line, right? So what's happening in the brain, and how do we address that?
That's actually probably more of a Meredith question about the
Okay.
explosion. So I don't know if Meredith, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I'm just thinking about it from the teacher perspective and the student perspective, in that we have to normalize emotions, and that when we're triggered, whether as an adult we read an email and there's something that somebody said that triggered us, or as a child we can't go to art class, that sends a signal to our brain that something about that situation feels really unsafe. For a child, it's unsafe because it's outside of the norm. It might be what they were looking forward to, as you described. For an adult, same thing. I wasn't expecting this email. I wasn't expecting to feel this way. And we feel it in our bodies. The thing that we can start to do is normalize these emotions. And I think, one of the things that we learned to do as a staff was get really clear on how we were feeling in a particular moment. So if I had a student that was starting to explode with their behavior, I needed to know what my triggers were, because then I could respond appropriately. So for example, if I had a student that was, for me as a principal, my trigger is aggression. That's something that upsets me. If I had a student flipping a table, I knew about myself, because I had done that work, that's going to upset me. That's going to make my amygdala fire. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm happy to elaborate on that a little bit more. I don't know if we want to, jump to that topic of what we can do in those moments. But I think one of the biggest things to just get us started is to understand our own emotions, normalize them, and then realize that we get triggered too. And we have to have a sense of what our triggers are so that we can stay regulated in those hot moments.
Yeah. I think it's probably a good it's a good time to segue. We can circle back to memory. I know we have some questions in the Q&A
Sure.
to Dr. Tsai. So that are going to be more on, I think, on your end of the side of the research. But, we've, it's important to understand what's happening in the students' brains, but it's also important, to your point, to understand what's happening in our brains as adults, right? So for teachers and aides and specialists and principals and those that are active on the school site, just understanding what triggers us. And so we did a poll, right? And so it says 62% are with you, Meredith. Aggression is their single, worst trigger. With work avoidance coming in second at 18%, inappropriate language at 12%, and eye rolling at 8%. So it seems like we can handle the eye rolling a little bit better than we can handle the flipping of the table or a student just, putting their head down and not doing the work. So, how can teachers alleviate problematic behaviors? I know this is, what you've done. You've devoted your career to learning and to teaching. So share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to first start from the teacher perspective and understand where they're coming from. So right now, as a result of the pandemic, so many schools are in a staffing shortage. I talk to my husband every day after work, and he will tell me, I did not stop all day. I was not alone at any point during the day from the moment I walked in the door to the moment I left. And I can relate to that. I was a principal and I know what that feels like. And so when Dr. Tsai was talking about executive functioning and needing to take breaks, there's no time. It feels like there's no time. I'm constantly covering a class or I'm getting pulled in a different direction. So you have that level of tension happening in the background. And then I go home at night and I plan this lesson. I get really excited about the lesson and I put in so much time. I even lost a little bit of sleep to make sure that everything is perfect and ready. And I'm going to engage these children tomorrow. And then one student loses it and the whole lesson, for lack of a better word, flips on its head, right? And I've got a table flipping and I am so personally disappointed and overstimulated in that moment. And I remember as a principal, I remember I was handling a situation. I was running from the back of the building to the front of the building. And I thought to myself, I am way too overstimulated. And that's what's happening to our educators across the country. We are asking so much of them because students came back with many gaps that we saw, the achievement gap. Oh my gosh, that only widened as a result of the pandemic. So you have this added pressure. You have no time during the day to even breathe or take a moment to reset for yourself. You're pulled in a million directions, and then you have escalated student behavior. And so one thing that we try to do is really help educators learn to normalize their emotions and to say, I'm not well. And it's okay. Like, I don't have to be well in every moment and feel good in every moment to be a normal, good human. And I think, one of the things I like to always share is understanding our own triggers and then our own reactions to stress. So for example, for me, I'm a person that when I experience stress, I get really loud, not in front of people inappropriately, right? Like not in front of my staff. My staff wouldn't have known that. I, hold it all together and I smile and keep things running. But I would get in my car and I just want to scream. And I would get home and the way that I expressed myself, because I'm a very hyper aroused person when I'm stressed out, was I needed to get it out, right? And the more I started to study this work and do the research, I realized I'm pretty normal, but I always felt so weird. And I felt like something was wrong with me and I should keep my stuff together. And so over time, I learned to say to my husband, who is my best friend, I need to yell. And I'm going to yell sometimes when I tell you about how I'm feeling, but I'm not yelling at you.
Right.
I wasn't abusive to him. I wasn't, name calling. I was in control enough to be able to say, what I need is to scream. And I still do this. Even just a couple of weeks ago, I was writing a grant. I couldn't get a file to upload and I'd been working on it for hours and I was overwhelmed and a million things happening in the background. And he came upstairs and he's like, how was your day? And I can't get this file to upload, and we've learned as a couple that that's normal. He's a very even person. That's not how he responds to stress. Our daughter, on the other hand, when she's really stressed out, she wants to go in bed and hide. She doesn't want to speak to anybody, right? So for her, that's a hypo arousal. She's so stressed out, she can't seem to make that first step that needs to be had. And so we try to help her get out of bed and take a step and normalize for her. Right. So if you think about my personality with her personality, or if we put it with two students, you've got me, and I'm a teacher, maybe that I get upset really easily. And then I've got a kiddo that's flipping a table. Imagine the tension there, right? And how we make that even more exacerbated than it needs to be. Or I have a student who's like my daughter, instead of hiding in the bed, they're hiding under the table. And you've got my personality that's like, come on, we got to move. We got things to do. I've got teaching to like, and that's only going to upset that child. So what we have to do is learn to regulate. We regulate ourselves first, and we want to find a match. So when I take a breath in that situation where there's, it's starting to amp up, and I have to be aware of myself first. This student is really frustrating me, and my amygdala is firing off. I don't feel safe because they are starting to escalate, and that's a trigger for me. I know I have the potential to also escalate because that's my behavior. So I have to work on that, right? And then the match comes in the reverse when I need to help that student make a first step or get out of bed, so to speak, or come up off the desk, that I'm not doing it so high with intensity. I've got to match to where they are. And I think those things really help me to stay regulated and to normalize the fact that I'm going to feel a certain way about the behaviors that I'm surrounded by.
And so I think this is a good time to ask the poll question of, let me go ahead and throw this one out there. So I'm going to end this poll that we just did, and I'm going to go on to the next one. I can share the results with everybody, which I verbally went over. But the next question for you is, how many of you have worked with someone? Oops, it's not launching. I don't know why. Hold on one second. Okay, stop sharing. All right, moving on to the next one. So how many of you worked an adult that has made the situation worse, right? Like isn't self-aware to know when I'm uncomfortable, I'm intense, and I don't realize that my voice changes. And so knowing that about myself is really important, right? So 100%. Thanks, you guys.
Yes. So I love that.
What's the technique then, right? Besides doing some self-reporting, like awareness, how do you know that about yourself? And what do you do?
Well, I think it's to recognize that if we're all saying that about each other, it's probably true about us too. That there's times that we make the situation worse, and there's times that our colleagues make it worse, and nobody intends to make anything worse. That's never the intention of any educator. I had a situation where a student was in and out of foster care, and she was really dysregulated one morning. She came to school wanting chicken nuggets for lunch. By the time she got to the cafeteria, she wanted pizza. And she asked the manager, hey, and she's like very upset, and she's really dysregulated. It's like, can I please have a pizza? And the manager says no. So she was smart. She went and got her teacher, because her teacher is an advocate for her. And her teacher said, I really need you to give her that pizza today. No, I can't do that. What they order in the morning is what they get in the afternoon. And so the student just goes, full on meltdown. And so when I was then brought into the situation, at that point, I lost my cool. I go storming down in my high heels, and I'm like, give her the pizza. And I thought about it after, and I thought, well, really, my manager wasn't doing anything wrong. The policy is we don't change lunches, and she doesn't know that there's something about this child that's happening in the background. We can't change lunch choices for kids every day. We have chaos. And how is she supposed to know, honestly? And so sometimes adults make things worse because they don't know. And I always say not knowing is a calm killer, right? When we don't know, we don't have the information, calm can be disrupted easily. So I thought about it for a really long time, and a couple of other incidents had happened in our school, and I thought, what am I doing? Like I've got a big job to do to help staff be more empathetic towards our kids. So I ended up buying every single staff member a red sticker that was a heart sticker. And if you if you've been in a school, you know that nowadays everybody wears a lanyard with a badge. And I asked every staff member to stick the red sticker, the heart, on their lanyard. And we taught them that was going to become a communication tool. So without me having to tell you the juicy details about what's going on with you, Melissa, and what happened to you last night, I could, as the staff member, flash to the other staff member the red heart. And I'm basically saying to you, Melissa is going through something, or I'm basically saying Melissa is going through something. Dr. Tsai, I need you to take a deep breath. I need you to just realize that this is a different situation. This is a time to handle this with care. And me flashing that red heart to Dr. Tsai is going to help bring some calm to the situation and basically say to that other adult, stand down, because Melissa needs us to do something different today for her. And I think for us that became one of the biggest ways that we changed culture. And I bought red hearts for my bus drivers, and everybody knew if a student was in a situation, we didn't tell the student, hey, you're a red heart. We didn't go around telling, their whole background, but we did adult to adult use it as a tool to just say, take a deep breath. This is going to be a handle with care situation. And it really helped shift the culture accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I just think that type of awareness amongst yourselves as adults trickles down to how you're responding to the child, right? Having that level of awareness is super important. And Dr. Tsai, I'm going back to, thinking about from the student perspective, like why it would be so important, not only for the student to understand their cognitive needs, but also for the teacher to understand that about the student. So while we're seeing this sort of behavior, that, what is the link then to the cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and why would understanding that be so important?
Right. So you're right. So everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, across cognition, and I think understanding sort of where you are, on a day-to-day basis, even because sometimes you go into the classroom, and even if you have generally really good working memory, if you just sort of spend all night on the news reading about some terrible war, you're not going to be able to show up to class, at your best. And maybe if I were, someone were to administer a working memory task, you're just not going to do as well as you normally do, right? So, understanding that everyone's cognitive profiles, will be very unique, but also unique even on a day-to-day basis to some degree, to some extent, not, it's not going to, vary wildly, but there's going to be some changes depending on your social emotional environment and context. I think that's incredibly critical. Like as a teacher, I can imagine having that sensitivity, knowing that, you had a large group of students who just witnessed, a horrific crime in their neighborhood or something. Or there was a mass shooting that was, just however many, that was one school away or something, or down the block. Having that sensitivity to be okay, my students are coming into the classroom today not at their cognitive best, because there's all these other factors going on that are kind of overloading their system. How can I then, sort of reach out, point at the heart to other adults, and make sure that we're able to support the kids and meet them at their needs during that day. Mm-hmm. So hope that answers your question about cognitive.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would think that to your point, a student that already maybe struggles with working memory and has a hard time completing multi-step instructions, and then they've experienced some sort of trauma or stress. It could be the morning of or during the week, maybe a family member sick, and they're sort of thinking about that and processing it. And so then when I say, all right, everybody, you need to sit down at your desk, take out your book, take out your binder, take out your pen, do this, take notes, look up at the board. I mean, that student was probably already shut down at instruction number 3 to begin with. But then if you consider the environmental factors of what might be happening in that student's life, I mean, they're lucky that they got through step 1, right? Mm-hmm. But from a teacher's perspective, you might see it as work avoidance, or even just some sort of nonverbal, seriously, teacher, or they might even say something verbally. And so understanding that student's area of need to begin with, plus the environmental factor is super important. But I'm also just thinking from a teacher's perspective, I got 30 kids I got to figure this out on. How am I going to do that, right? It's an impossible task when they're dealing with their own maybe.
Right, but actually, Melissa, what I would want to say is it's not even like students who are necessarily like weak in certain areas, but maybe there are certain kids who might, like just be more sensitive to certain things. So like even if the kid is normally like you're like Josh was normally so good at his math, he's like so on top of it, or he's really good at like even, like going between his like English and Spanish or something, or I don't know, I'm like kind of coming up with random examples in the classroom, but like even if you have a kid who is normally like very high in certain areas, and then they came back from whatever experience from home, it could be personal or whatever, and then they're just it's going to like vary the next day, and it could manifest in what we might think as like acting out, not doing the work, not really wanting to perform, or like maybe a little bit more fussy, or maybe even being more aggressive. So I think there's a lot of really interesting cognitive things to consider.
Yeah. And
Dr.
Meredith,
Tsai.
yeah, oh, go ahead. I was just going to say,
No,
give
no, thank you. I was just so excited about a couple of things that you said, particularly when you were talking about executive functioning and the mainstreaming mindfulness and some of those ways that we can regulate emotions. And I think that's true for teachers too. So one of the things that we like to teach is that in the first 5 minutes, and if you don't have 5, do 2, that you start your class with calm music. When the doors open, you're greeting students at the door. You are allowing time for your regulation to occur in that moment as well, because you're breathing with your students. You're teaching them to breathe. You're normalizing breathing. And I think, when we think about how busy we are all day as educators, if we build that in and we normalize that, hey, this is something we are not going to make an option. It is a non-negotiable in our school when we switch classes or we begin the day that we start that way. Those little changes can make such a big difference. So I didn't want to interrupt, but I was really excited as you were talking a lot about just regulating within and setting students up for success. It's true for teachers too.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking about just, those are the kinds of skills that teachers are embedding into the everyday experience of a classroom, that when it resonates with a particular student, that's a gift that they're going to carry with them through, if they're in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, like I need to start my day by running, because then it makes me think more clearly. Like I think about my son's 5th grade teacher who had, she had a potpourri of different student needs in that classroom. And she started off, she did that, every kid, we're just going to run a lap around the field before we start class. And then she'd go right into the math. That was the most challenging for most of her students. They'd go on to other, activities after lunch, which, can sometimes be socially stressful. They've been running around, they've been eating, they've been having lots of conversations. Use that time then to play a meditation. Like there's an app that's just specifically, for elementary school kids, and walked through that. And so she built in these moments throughout the day that were non-academic, that was really teaching them how to, calm themselves to access their learning. And it's just, she's one of the best. She's, those teachers that change every kid's life. Like she was definitely one of those, doing those techniques. So we have time for Q&A, unless you guys have anything else that you want to share. I know we have several questions in the Q&A. And I know that our Senior Director of Learning has been answering some of those questions throughout the webinar today. And a few of them have been saved for live answers. So the one question that we have is, so how do we help parents develop this self-efficacy when maybe they're not able to do it themselves? The teachers are working hard at learning this. They're trying to get their students to understand it, but how do we pull in the parent to understand, maybe their role in how this dynamic is working?
I'm happy to answer that one.
Okay.
Having worked with so many parents, and I remember one of our students who was demonstrating a lot of aggressive behavior on a daily basis, and we were at a loss for really what was going to work for that child. And we really wanted to build a better relationship with his mom, and so I was able to get mom to come in and meet with me, and was kind of explaining to her some of the behaviors that we had been seeing, and mom just starts screaming at him. I mean, that was her way of showing that she was engaged in that moment. But I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I would not handle it that way, right? And so the more I've studied, the more I've learned, the more I realize that we have to be culturally appropriate in the way that we're working with our parents as well. Because I think a stressor for us at times is when someone does something different than how we would do it.
Absolutely.
So that parent was responding so differently than how I would respond if I was called into the principal's office to talk about my child's behavior. I really, to be honest with you, in that moment, wanted the parent to thank me. I think a lot of teachers feel like that. I'm doing a lot for your child. We as a staff are going out of our way. Do you have any idea how much time we are giving your child? And it would be nice to hear thank you, right? That's a cultural need of mine, because for me, that's how I would handle it. I would start off and I would say, thank you so much. And I'm so embarrassed and blah, 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 and I appreciate you. That's my need, my cultural background, my lived experience. For the parent on the other end, we have to remember that so many of the families that we're working with don't have a positive schooling experience. So they're coming into school already on guard. They already feel like you think they're less than. And when we start trying to get them to parent the way we would parent, it really is a disservice, and it's a mismatch to the needs of the child and the family. So I think I had to learn to let go of some of what I think is best and realize that there are different ways that people approach working with their child's teacher and not take it so personal. So when we talk about building self-efficacy in parents, I think the best way to do that is through a relationship, but not centering that relationship on our own lens and our own culture, but really listening to the parent. So in that particular situation with that child, and in many situations, I spent more time asking the parents for what they thought, what are the strengths of their child, what do they see, and less time telling the parent what they needed to do or how they could be a better parent. Even if we say that in masked ways, we don't come out and say it, but a lot of times the things that we suggest, come across to that parent as we think we know more. Now, we are educators and we do know a lot, and sometimes we do know information that could be helpful or interventions that could be tried at home. So I'm a big proponent of sharing those suggestions, but we have to couple that with finding the strengths that the parents come with and their cultural strengths as well. And then coming back to the red hearts, when we would work with a student and had identified them as a red heart, then we were able to work with staff to say, here are all the strengths of that child. So when we respond, it's the who and the how. Who is the best person to work with this child when they're upset? Because it might not be me. It may not be the classroom teacher. It might be the art teacher. And what are the best methods? How will we respond? So what specifically will we do for that child? And you can learn a lot from talking to parents. So I guess building efficacy by building a bridge would be my answer.
Yeah. It's as you were talking, I was thinking, how do you balance that of, I'm with your child for half of their day during their life, and I think I know them pretty well. And yet you're the parent and you know what's best, but you might have some unique insights to share. And that's just a really tricky conversation. But I like your approach of asking the parent the questions about what they think their strengths and areas to support are, and then what that maybe looks like in the classroom and how they could also support that in the home. So creating sort of that bridge between the parent and the teacher. That's great. I'm still loving that red heart. I mean, I might just wear that and look at my kids and be like, mom's having a moment today. Or more importantly, maybe my husband.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to circle back, Dr. Tsai, on, you're like, I have a few tips on how teachers can support executive functions and support memory in the classroom. Can you just, 3 and 3, or I'm sure it's not just 3 things and 3 things, but just so that our audience walks away with a little bit of insight on how, they can support students in executive function and memory.
Absolutely. Like some actionable things. Well,
Yeah.
I think, how do you sort of support memory in the classroom, especially when students are struggling or whatever. So I think some common or really easy things that they can, teachers or administrators might be able to implement might be even simple as adopting open book policies during test taking. And you know, I don't see it as cheating, but you know, this doesn't tax your like memory as much. Like you're like, you know, like you're like, oh, you know, I remember learning about this, but like, and it was in this section on this page, and you know, it's sort of like you need that extra boost. And so having things like, you know, open book, or even like having a 1-pager notes that you know, a cheat sheet that students can create, can also almost like be helpful. And I find that when students do like create that 1-pager cheat sheet, they almost like, the ones who do it don't even need it, because you know, the process of like generating all that information and like all the deep studying that goes into like creating that cheat sheet, it kind of makes that cheat sheet moot, you know. So like, you know, using sort of those tips and like, you know, implementing those type of things in the classroom, I think can, you know, like help sort of, you know, give a little crutch to memory issues. But also I think more importantly, you know, like teachers might want to think about like longer term solutions to like improve or help enhance learning in the classroom, that are sort of all encompassing, regardless of like what memory issues students might have. And it's like really having and incorporating like active rather than passive learning. And so things that I've always had students do, and they actually really enjoy it, I include it as like sort of like a, you know, if you do this, I will like give you extra credit. But like I always have students, or give students the option of like generating test questions, and engaging in peer teaching. And both of these methods are incredibly, like I would say, active. Like you're forcing students to actively create, like think through content and come up with like a really good, hopefully really good, not just like yes or no, but like either a comprehension type question, or like a long, like a, you know, a more evolved like multiple choice question, and even like generating test questions. You know, students are like what we call, it's called like the testing effect. So like by having students like sort of test themselves and like, or experience tests frequently, it's actually like helpful for like long-term learning overall. And then even like, and engaging in like peer teaching. So just like, you know, having students break up into groups and like, you know, student A like teach student B, like, you know, chapter 1 versus chapter 2, like that peer teaching activity actually is incredibly helpful. You know, just like any sort of opportunities that teachers can find where students aren't just like passively going through material, because, you know, we all know that like, even if students like read a whole page, when you ask them like, what did you actually read? They're like, well, I don't know, my eyes like did follow the words, but like, you know, they're not really fully engaged. And like really forcing, or, you know, encouraging that sort of active engagement, whether or not it's creating test questions, working together to teach each other, creating opportunities where they're like, you know, like learning is difficult, and we call it like desirable difficulty. You want that mental sweat, right? It shouldn't be easy. If it's too easy, maybe you're not like, you know, storing it into like long-term memory. And so I encourage teachers to sort of lean into a lot of active learning strategies.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, you know, even asking just the question, what are we trying to teach you or understand about the student when it comes to even approaching a test, right? Are we testing their memory, or are we testing their knowledge and ability to process and to do something? So like thinking about something just as simple as a math exam. If there's a ton of different formulas that they have to choose from and have to memorize, and those aren't available to them, if they have a prep sheet, as somebody suggested in the Q&A, instead of calling it a cheat sheet, a prep sheet that, you know, doesn't tell them the answers, but it's got the formulas there. And then they have to look at the question. They have to decide which formula do I use? That's the kind of thing we want, right? And then I have to solve for that problem. So now we're alleviating a memory issue and really looking at, do they understand the math that we're teaching, right?
Yes, because I mean, like Melissa, you nailed it like right on the head. Like it's just really like, as we prepare our learners for like, you know, 21st century jobs, it's like they're not really relying on like you know, long-term like algorithms and models. And like I can't like recite back like the models that I had to memorize in like calculus 1A or something in college. But you know, and we have like calculators for things, and but you know, it's really about our processing, our ability to sort of deduce information, put together different pieces of information together in like really, you know, intelligent, creative ways. And so I think that's really what we really want to test for, is how people can put things together.
And so there's this sort of regulation of emotion that we're talking about today. or excuse me,
Mhm.
normalization of regulation of emotion and normalization of providing what some may have considered like an accommodation. But really, if we're giving that to all students, then we're meeting probably everybody's cognitive abilities at that point, and just providing an opportunity that maybe they didn't know that they needed.
Mhm.
And so I love this idea of normalizing, identifying, having self-awareness as a teacher, as an education leader, having self-awareness as a student, and knowing what are my learning needs, what are the strategies that I need to use to access learning, but what are the strategies that I need as an adult to understand, man, that really made me go, when they did that in the classroom, I had to walk out of the room, but you can't walk out of the room, right? So, how do you cope with that? And so having that self-awareness is so important. Let me see if we have any other questions here. There was one question that was just about, certain school policies is,
Hmm.
not being able to touch kids and having to go through certain trainings to know how to restrain with, properly. And, is that contributing to sort of behavior, these sort of school policies? What do you think?
Yeah,
Meredith, you're probably
I
best to
can just share
answer
with
that.
you. Well, I can't get fired because I no longer work for the school system, but I maybe should have been fired about maybe 10 to 15 years ago when I was practicing restraints and not intentionally doing them wrong. But after, evolution of thinking, I look back and think, oh my gosh, that is not the way I should have handled it. And I was trained. I mean, I was trained in restraints, and
Yeah.
I understood at that time that that's what I thought was best. And I've since realized that we really have to be, for so many reasons, so many times, even when we're trained, the way that we implement a restraint is not appropriate. And we've got to be really careful nowadays. So it's like, well, what do we do? Right. I mean, in our own households, we, I know when my little girl was 3 years old, and she did something, I spanked her on the bottom for the first time. I called my brother and I was crying. I was like, oh my gosh. But that was helpful. And that in our family culturally was appropriate to spank her on the bottom. We don't do that in school today. We don't restrain except for in very extreme situations. And so we sometimes get back to that idea of, when I don't know, it's a calm killer, because if I can't, handle this in the way that I used to, I'm not sure what to do. And so
Mm.
I would say to never go at it alone. And when I look back on the situations that I've been in where I use restraints and now have since evolved my thinking, what I realize is that I have to huddle and plan in order to be able to work with that student appropriately. So first, I want to just say that when you're in that situation, make sure that you're following your school's policies. Of course, I've got to say that, but it's important to get the right stakeholders together to process what happened. So let's say you have a kindergartner, and those people that work with high schoolers sometimes thinks that, elementary, it's easy breezy. I will say, come to my school and I will show you that a 5-year-old can rock your world, And so, but we've got a 5-year-old throwing books and, truly being aggressive in a way that could harm others. And maybe I didn't handle it the best in that situation, but the thing that we can do to follow up to make sure I do a better job the next time is to huddle and plan. And huddling, in the way that we used it, is every stakeholder involved that worked with that child would have come to my office at the end of the day. We would have stood, not sat, because no one has time for a meeting, no agenda. We're standing feet to feet, eye to eye, and we're processing what happened. And we're thinking about who and how. So who will be involved next time, and how will we approach this? Playing off of that student's strengths. What is it that is the root of the behavior? Why did that happen? What maybe caused that behavior to become explosive? What interventions could we have used to calm the situation before it got to that point where he was throwing books? And then when or if he throws books again, or he elopes, or she, punches, whatever it is, what is the plan? And getting everybody on the same page. And we would huddle sometimes 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the day. Then first thing in the morning, let's huddle up. Does everybody know the plan? This is how we will respond. And we were really diligent in sharing the load and making sure that we were responding in a really uniform way. A quick tip I'll say about that too is to not allow for too many adults to talk. So when you want to calm a situation down, identify the one adult who will talk to the child, the one adult who will lead the conversation and lead the demand or command that you're giving to the child, rather than everybody jumping in and having input and just elevating the chaos. So huddling and planning can be really effective. And the last thing I'll say about that is our educators, more than ever before, need the support of their leaders. Oh my God, it's so near and dear to my heart. And, you know, if you're a leader and you have a hard time hearing what I'm going to say it anyway. Sometimes we as the leaders are causing more of the problems because our educators don't feel our support. My husband, who I talked about at the beginning, is a middle school teacher, has a new principal this year. Despite how difficult his job is, he comes home happier every single day because he feels the support of his leader. She's not perfect. She doesn't have all the answers, but he feels heard and seen. And number one, we need to make sure that we are creating a safe culture for the adults in the building too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I just think that idea of creating a safe culture trickles down, right? So if we're thinking about a child that's feeling out of control, but a teacher that's knows how to support that child, that immediately calms that child at a cognitive level. You have a leader that knows how to respond to a stressed out, burned out, whatever teacher, makes them feel a safe environment. And so creating that safe environment all the way around makes everybody feel, as Oprah would say, seen and heard, right? Which are the two things we want as humans. Nancy, do you have any further comments before we wrap up today? Sorry, Dr. Tsai.
No, but happy to take questions or extend any point you'd like me to extend, but no, nothing to add there.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I really, really appreciate it. And for our audience members, some of you might be thinking, this webinar really begs a question, like, how do I understand my students and my own cognitive needs and what my skills are and my weaknesses? And I just have to do the plug, since we're sponsoring the webinar, that Mindprint is the only K-12 solution that uses objective cognitive data to understand student strengths and needs, and we create those personal learning plans. And so if that's something that you're interested in, I'm going to go ahead and send more information along with the recording. But we are just so thankful to have both experts here today, Meredith and Dr. Tsai. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you
Stay
for
tuned,
having
everyone,
us.
for our
Yeah.
next webinar. We'll see you. Bye-bye.